Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Our top story. A group of Chinese people illegally entered Guam last year, and one of them is headed to jail. Here's the twist. They arrived on the island during a critical U.S. missile interception test that could help the U.S. deter Chinese missiles. President Trump threatening to ramp up tariffs an additional 10% on China. That comment just hours after he reiterated his good relationship with China and talked about Taiwan.
Is it also your policy that as long as you're president, China will never take Taiwan by force?
I never comment on that. I don't comment on anything because I don't want to ever put myself in that position.
Arkansas taking a stand against communist Chinese influence. Details on an effort to keep China out and off its land. And from Nebraska to Tennessee, Arkansas, and Utah, states are pushing bills to keep Americans' genetic data out of Beijing's hands.
If they're doing genetic sequencing for you within the United States of America, then they're getting your genomic information.
Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Before we dive into today's news, make sure to use the link down below to subscribe to our newsletter. Each week we round up the highlights and controversies happening around China and the world, and share an exclusive behind-the-scenes snapshot with our readers. Keep an eye out. The newsletter will land in your inbox Friday morning. A 30-day jail sentence starts this Tuesday for one Chinese national. The Justice Department says he was among a group of 7 arrested in Guam last December. Authorities accused him of illegally entering U.S. territory. But here's the catch. Their entry was around the time a key ballistic missile interception test was underway on the island. The person sentenced is a 22-year-old Chinese citizen named Jiang Kangle. Jiang was sentenced for conspiracy to transport illegal aliens to the U.S. and conspiracy to defraud the U.S. government. The DOJ said at least 4 people in Jiang's group were found in the vicinity of a military installation around the time of the Guam missile test. One day before his arrest, Jiang snuck himself and 7 other Chinese nationals into Guam by a boat. They departed from Saipan, the capital and largest island of the Northern Mariana Islands. It takes 10 hours to travel from Saipan to Guam by boat. Something to note, Saipan has a visa-free policy for Chinese nationals, meaning they can easily enter the Commonwealth. Because of it, the route from Saipan to Guam has become a favorable choice for many illegal Chinese immigrants looking to enter the U.S. territory. According to Guam officials, over 100 Chinese people have illegally entered the island through this route, and it's raising concerns among lawmakers. Guam is critical to U.S. defense, especially for countering threats posed by communist China. Guam is closer to China than to Hawaii. The island's delegate to the House, James Moylan, spoke to Fox News about it last year. He cited Guam's strategic location, saying, quote, "Every war game scenario that is played out involves Guam." Guam is home to both a submarine base and an Air Force base. It's also considered an unsinkable aircraft carrier thanks to its large capacity. Rick Fisher, senior fellow at the International Assessment and Strategy Center, sheds light on Guam's strategic importance.
It is the most important outpost for the United States in deterring a Chinese attack against Taiwan, Chinese military action against the Philippines, and Japan. Everything that the United States would have to do to deter or combat Chinese aggression will depend on access to functioning military bases in Guam.
Because of its location, Guam is also more vulnerable to attacks from China. In 2019, Beijing tested a ballistic missile nicknamed Guam Killer. Now the U.S. is arming Guam to the teeth, preparing for a worst-case scenario, a Chinese missile attack on Guam. The Pentagon successfully intercepted a ballistic missile off the coast of Guam during a test last December. The same test that the Chinese national Jiang was just sentenced over. That missile test was just the start. The U.S. government plans to pour $10 billion over the next decade into Guam's defense. President Trump says he's eyeing even higher tariffs on China, an additional 10% starting as early as next Tuesday. That's hours after he stressed his good relationship with Beijing. Here's the president speaking at his first cabinet meeting Wednesday.
Is it also your policy that as long as you're president, China will never take Taiwan by force?
I never comment on that. I don't comment on anything because I don't want to ever put myself in that position. And if I said it, I certainly wouldn't be saying it to you. I'd be saying it to other people, maybe people around this table. But I can tell you what, I have a great relationship with President Xi. I've had a great relationship with him. We want them to come in and invest. I see so many things saying that we don't want China in this country. That's not right. We want them to invest in the United States. That's good. That's a lot of money coming in, and we'll invest in China. I see all of these phony reports that we don't want their money, we don't want anything to do with them. That's wrong. We're going to have a good relationship with China, but they won't be able to take advantage of us.
He noted that his stance ties into the COVID-19 global pandemic and how it originated and spread from China.
I used to call it the China virus. I guess I can call it the China virus again, but you know, it's an accurate term, but I won't do that out of respect to China.
Despite his discourse showing a softer tone towards Beijing, the Trump administration has been making hawkish moves on China. Plus, the State Department even removed a line on its fact sheet stating that the U.S. doesn't support Taiwanese independence. Secretary of State Marco Rubio also recently exempted $1 billion worth of U.S. defense aid to Taiwan and the Philippines from foreign aid freezes. Back to Trump's tariff comments, he said the 25% tariffs on Mexico and Canada would take effect next Tuesday. Those measures will hit China hard too, as a large amount of Chinese goods enter the U.S. through those two countries. What's more, China has been accused of being the top source of precursor chemicals used to make the deadly drug fentanyl. The U.S. state of Arkansas is putting China on notice. Governor Sarah Huckabee Sanders introduced a slew of bills Wednesday, aiming to keep China off its land and out of the state.
The threat is real, and the enemy is here. They're targeting state governments, military bases, industrial sites, and every other facet of American society. And with President Trump back in the White House, I'm afraid they're only going to try to undermine our country more. That's why today we will take an even harder line against communist Chinese influence here in the state of Arkansas.
On the defense front, the legislation looks to ban Chinese companies from owning property near military bases. It would also prohibit lobbying on behalf of China and Russia. Looking to society and education, the Arkansas bill would sever sister city partnerships between the state and China. It would cut and ban funding to any college or university in Arkansas with Confucius Institutes on campus. China touts Confucius Institutes as cultural exchange and language centers, but critics say these institutes spread communist influence and bring Chinese state censorship into the classroom. The bills also aim to ban state-sponsored colleges and universities from investing in China. Governor Sanders said she wants the communist regime to know that it won't be able to set up shop in Arkansas or do the state harm. From Nebraska to Tennessee, Arkansas, and Utah, states are introducing or pushing through bills to protect Americans' genetic information from China. Utah and Arkansas introduced bills to ban medical facilities from using genetic sequencers or software from China. A similar bill also advanced in Tennessee. The efforts come as Chinese companies continue collecting genetic data from Americans. At a hearing in Nebraska last week, Michael Lucci, CEO of State Armor, testified about Beijing's ambition of winning the biotech war. He read a quote from a Chinese general on why the regime wants genomic information from around the world.
This general wrote, "In the development of biotechnology today, the most lethal weapons are genetically engineered weapons designed to attack people based on specific ethnic or racial background, causing specific races to become ill, such as suffering immune deficiency, loss of intelligence, sterilization, or even death, while leaving other races unscathed."
Lucci said Beijing uses one main tool to pursue that goal in the U.S., a company called BGI. The biotech company provides DNA sequencing services across the U.S., except for Idaho, where it's banned. DNA is extremely valuable information for Beijing. That's because it contains intimate details about its owner, like whether they're inclined toward addiction or at risk of getting cancer. Under Chinese law, companies have to hand over any and all information if Chinese officials ask for it. We spoke to Michael Lucci to dig deeper into the topic, as well as LB 644, the bill looking to protect American genomic data in Nebraska. Michael Lucci, thank you so much for joining us. Great to have you on the show.
Thank you. It's great to be on with you.
Now, another aspect is to regulate the storage and remote access of genetic sequencing data. Now, who has access right now? Would something like a Chinese genomics company, BGI, have access, or what's happening here?
So BGI and a number of their subsidiaries and affiliates are active within the United States of America. The important thing to know about Beijing Genomics Institute, it's sanctioned by our Department of Defense for working with China's military on creating bioweapons. So not good guys. It's sanctioned by our Commerce Department for their involvement in the surveillance and human rights abuses that occur in Western China. So bad guys, not a great company, but they are active within the United States. They do DNA sequencing. DNA sequencing is an important technology and process. Luckily, we still have producers, American producers, European producers, who do the same technology. This company, Beijing Genomics, falls under the same national security laws as every other Chinese company. Any data they get, they have to turn over to Beijing at request. We absolutely do not want them accessing American genomic information. China's side has talked about creating bioweapons that target people by ethnicity. So why would we allow their companies to be harvesting our genomic information? So what Senator Bostar, Governor Pillen, in their legislation, they're just cutting off BGI and saying, get out of the state of Nebraska.
Now, expanding on that, because you mentioned in the hearing, quote, when you have an adversary that openly tells you they intend to make genetically targeted bioweapons, you ought to cut off every vector you can by which they could access your genetic information. Now, what are some of the access that, right now BGI has access to?
If they're doing genetic sequencing for you within the United States of America, then they're getting your genomic information. Now, where are they storing that? There are some indications that some of that's stored in China, of course. Maybe they're storing it here in the United States. But if you think about TikTok, they would say that they were storing all the American data in the United States. But lo and behold, it kept getting accessed by China's government. So if you have a Chinese technology company like Beijing Genomics that's getting your data, that is going to be subject to rendition to China. So we're just saying, they shouldn't be getting your data at all. They shouldn't be in the business of doing genetic sequencing within the United States. If they want to do that type of surveillance work in China, then go do it over there. But what Nebraska is saying is hospitals, research centers, we just don't want them using this technology. This technology from Chinese companies.
I want to dig into LB 644 because one of it, it also aims to change provisions of the Foreign Adversary Contracting Prohibition Act. Now, what would those changes do? Would it impact things like drones under DJI, or what are some examples of what the changes would do?
So Nebraska, in 2024, Nebraska passed a law that said they won't buy any technologies from China across the board. This is super important because technologies such as routers, such as cameras coming from China have known backdoors. It's just pure espionage. Drones are also not great coming from China, but we have to shift off that supply chain gradually. And so what the legislation does is it gives law enforcement a little bit more time before they have to fully stop using those drones. So Nebraska is saying those drones have to stop being used by law enforcement. They're just giving them a little bit more time. So the important thing is Nebraska did great legislation last year, cutting off all this Chinese spyware. They've led on cutting off Huawei equipment, which was spread across the state of Nebraska. It's been Senator Bostar, it's been Governor Pillen. And so what you're seeing this year on procurement, it's just a tweak of a great solution they did last year in part of this big omnibus legislation they did in 2024.
Michael Lucci, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Coming up, the U.S. sanctions 6 more entities in China for their connections to Iran's weapons programs. Concerns grow over 2 major nuclear-armed nations. Secretary of State Marco Rubio unveils plans to combat the growing ties between Russia and China. And test scores show that Chinese students are 2 years ahead of those from other countries. Are the numbers credible?
It's just accidental. A friend of mine, daughter in Shanghai, who happened to be one of the students tested,
What did she experience? Find out more after the break here on China in Focus. Welcome back to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. The State Department announced sanctions on 6 entities in China and Hong Kong Wednesday. That's over their connections to Iran's drone and missile programs.
The move is part of President Trump's maximum pressure campaign on the Iranian regime to stop its weapons supply. This comes just a couple of days after the U.S. imposed a fresh round of sanctions on Iran's oil industry, which is their primary source of revenue. Earlier this month, the Trump administration put financial sanctions on an international network they say ships Iranian oil to China.
Secretary of State Marco Rubio is proposing a plan to manage Russia's relationship with China. Earlier Thursday, he warned that growing cooperation between China and Russia could destabilize global security, and that allowing them to form an alliance would put two major nuclear-armed nations against the U.S. A Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson responded to Rubio's comments, saying that relations between Beijing and Moscow aren't influenced by third-party sources. He also emphasized that their long-term strategic and foreign policies would continue regardless of international involvement. Meanwhile, President Trump and Russian leader Vladimir Putin held talks in Saudi Arabia last week, aiming to end the war in Ukraine. Putin expressed hope after meeting with the Trump administration, voicing support for further cooperation between the U.S. and Russia. The latest test scores for China say Chinese students are ahead of the curve, but a paper reveals there's more to the story. To discuss the findings, NTD Steve Land spoke with Nicholas Eberstadt. He holds the Henry Wendt Chair in Political Economy at the American Enterprise Institute.
Mr. Nicholas Eberstadt, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you for inviting me.
It's great to have you with us. Now, China's international test scores reportedly more than 100 points higher than the corresponding averages for countries in the EOECD. You've been looking into this. China known to fudge on their numbers when it comes to their GDP, according to some economists. Tell us what you found in this working paper of yours.
With three colleagues, Patrick Narek, Radek Sabatka, and Peter Van Ness, we took a deep dive into the information on academic achievement for the K through 12s in China. As you said, Steve, the OECD's kind of premier international standardized testing metric is called PISA, and by all indications from the test reports, China's hitting it out of the park. Their students are on average 2 years ahead of their counterparts in the OECD and the rich developed countries on the whole. They're even ahead of Singapore, which up until then was regarded as number one. On looking at these numbers in some detail, we concluded that the China numbers did not pass the most important statistical test of all. And that statistical test is one that I call the laugh out loud test. When you remember that China is an enormous country with a huge rural hinterland, and that the students are being sampled in the only 4 of the 31 provinces, these being 4 of the most developed, of course, you've got a problem to begin with. But then as you pick at it further, the results look irreproducible. It doesn't, neither the OECD nor the Ministry of Education in China gives access so that people can try to verify or validate these. Let me give you an anecdote. This is just accidental. A friend of mine, daughter in Shanghai, who happened to be one of the students tested. What was her experience? Well, she's in what's probably the best school in high school in Shanghai, so that's cherry picking. She's in the top performing class in the best high school, so that's cherry picking. The teachers drop all instruction and just teach to this test for 6 weeks. That's more than cherry picking. And then the vice mayor of Shanghai comes in and gives them a lecture about how important it is for them to perform well for their nation, and if their parents are giving them any homework, to tell them go get lost. This is not the way kids in Massachusetts who take this test are treated. Let's put it that way.
Beyond bragging rights that China is looking for here, what are the implications? Why does it matter? And what implications does it have, not just domestically in China, but I guess you could say internationally?
Well, if these numbers were representative of China's entire student population, we'd be expecting China to take over the world economy in a generation, because these fantastic test takers would be the labor force of the future. We brought a lot of additional data to bear. It's a little bit like, kind of like Sherlock Holmes, because this is not exactly an open and transparent situation. But when we looked at some test results for rural areas, when we look at IQ tests for kids in rural areas, when we looked at the problem with the left behind children, tried to take a look at other test results, we ended up concluding that our working hypothesis is that China as a whole probably has a sort of educational quality for its kids akin to, say, Turkey. Now, Turkey is a middle high income country, which has got a perfectly creditable economy and educational system, but nobody talks about Turkey as being number one, and they probably shouldn't be talking about China as being number one in knowledge and skills for all of their kids.
Nicholas Eberstadt, American Enterprise Institute, really appreciate you joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
That's all for today's China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. If you have any feedback on the show or have something you'd like to see us cover, send us an email at chinainfocus@ntd.com. We'd love to hear from you. For round-the-clock original news coverage, visit us at ntd.com or download our NTD app. Thanks for watching. See you tomorrow.